Continuing our journey on The Rise, the Limit, we move to Chapter 10, on salt, Salem, and sunken silver. After witnessing how the Lucayan people were brutally eradicated from these islands, we now explore what followed, over a century of complete abandonment until Bermudian salt collectors arrived in 1678 to build an industry powered by enslaved labor. This chapter follows the remarkable story of treasure hunter William Phips, whose recovery of Spanish gold would catapult him to become Royal Governor of Massachusetts, where he would face the Salem Witch Trials and grapple with the dangerous power of unverified accusations. Leaving the ghostly remnants of the SpaceX rocket behind and watching my son steer the golf cart through the scrub, my attention drifted from modern space junk to the island's own empty spaces in time. I was looking for the historical pause button, a century and a half when the Turks and Caicos simply ceased to matter to the outside world. Once the Spanish had finished their work, emptying the archipelago of its native Lucayans by 1540, the islands became a ghost story. For the next 130 years, they were the Caribbean's dusty attic, a set of misplaced keys in the junk drawer of the New World. Ships occasionally passed, mostly pirates who, contrary to the fiction, spent more time hunting for potable water than buried chests. You cannot make grog with brine, and a pirate with a urinary tract infection is a significant personnel liability. This long intermission, a profound silence between violent acts, broke around 1678. The disturbance came not from the roar of cannons, but from the crunch of sturdy shoes on salt crust. Bermudians arrived with the sensibilities of accountants. They looked at the vast, shallow ponds baking under the sun and saw a business plan. It was nature's own condiment factory, waiting for management. They weren't founding a colony so much as launching a spice company with excellent beaches. Herein lies the paradox that built this place. The Bermudian entrepreneurs developed salt pans on Grand Turk, Salt Cay, and South Caicos, birthing a booming trade. But raking salt is hateful work. It involves standing all day in caustic brine under a sun that wants to kill you, scraping crystals from the mud. This was not a job for the investors. It was a job for enslaved Africans, imported to serve as the machinery of the harvest. Families like the Astwoods became the salt barons of Grand Turk, their fortunes rising like white pyramids from the pans, crystallized from the agony of others. The seasonal rhythm of the salt harvest differed from the year-round grind of sugar plantations elsewhere, but it was bondage all the same. The sun that generated wealth for the owners burned the backs of the men and women forced to harvest it. Yet, history harbors a cruel irony. The practical skills forced upon them, boat building, reading the weather, and the seamanship required to move cargo, became the very tools used to forge independent lives after emancipation. A new society, carved from an empty one, was founded not on Genesis's command for light, but on a grim commercial whisper, "Let there be salt." Turks and Caicos, Westminster's wavering will. While the salt pans gave the archipelago a commercial purpose, they did not grant it political stability. Determining who exactly has been in charge of this place over the last 3 centuries is less a study in linear governance than an unraveling of a colonial custody battle. The administrative history does not follow a straight line. It zigs and zags like a drunk track through the scrub, marked by apathy, annexation, and the occasional suspension of democracy. For over 100 years, starting in 1678, the islands functioned as an informal extension of Bermuda. It was an arrangement of convenient neglect. Bermudian rakers worked the pans during the dry season and retreated when the rains came, treating the archipelago less like a colony and more like an unsupervised quarry. It was a functional, if unregulated, side hustle. The British Crown, an entity generally opposed to administrative ambiguity, eventually intervened. In 1799, despite local protest, London formalized the territory's status by annexing it to the Bahamas. It was a forced marriage that pleased no one. Placing the Turks and Caicos under the thumb of Nassau, a capital hundreds of miles away, relegated the islands to the status of a poor relation, a revenue stream managed by a distinct and preoccupied uncle. The friction was immediate, and the governance ineffective. After decades of agitation, the islands eventually won a separation in 1848, entering a brief presidency period of self-rule under British supervision. It was a short-lived taste of autonomy. By 1874, following economic stagnation and a devastating hurricane, London reshuffled the deck again, this time handing the territory over to Jamaica. The local council was dissolved, and for nearly 90 years, the laws of Kingston governed the streets of Grand Turk. The modern identity of the Turks and Caicos only truly began to coalesce as the British Empire dismantled itself in the Caribbean. When Jamaica moved toward independence in 1962, TCI did not follow, opting instead to become a separate crown colony. It was briefly chaperoned by the governor of the Bahamas until that nation also severed ties with Britain in 1973. Finally, the islands stood alone as a British overseas territory, answering directly to London. Even this direct relationship comes with an asterisk. Self-government is not guaranteed, it is permitted. London has suspended the local administration twice, most recently from 2009 to 2012, sending in British auditors to run the islands directly following allegations of systemic corruption. It was a stark reminder that the territory's autonomy remains conditional, liable to be revoked when the books don't balance. Today, the system is a bureaucratic hybrid. King Charles III is the head in state, represented by a governor who retains control over defense and internal security, while an elected local premier manages domestic policy. The people are British citizens, yet their final court of appeal sits an ocean away in London. After 3 centuries of being passed between guardians, from Bermuda to Nassau to Kingston and back to London, the map remains dotted with the names of the absentee aristocrats and temporary overlords who managed this portfolio from afar. Monk's Gold, Bahama Billions, and Duke's Legacy. The administrative lineage of the islands, that confusing zigzag from Bermuda to London, felt abstract until I looked down at the map of the resort itself. Amidst the winding cart paths and guest amenities, my finger landed on Monck Beach, a name assigned to the long, placid strand of white sand where the bungalows sit like patient herons. The moniker suggested piety, perhaps a simple man in robes who had once contemplated the divine on this shore. The reality, I found, was less spiritual and significantly more transactional. Digital inquiries on the resort's network revealed the namesake to be Christopher Monck, 2nd Duke of Albemarle. Inheriting his title at 16, Monck reached adulthood with the vast resources and limited oversight that often characterized disastrous colonial careers. By his 30s, he was a Knight of the Garter and a Privy Councillor, eventually appointed Lieutenant Governor of Jamaica. His time governing that island was a spectacular failure. He arrived to manage the planters, found himself managed by them, and controversially appointed the ex-privateer Henry Morgan to his council. He died at 35, leaving no heir and a record of administrative turmoil. With his line extinguished and his governance criticized, the choice to name a slice of paradise after him seemed baffling, until I followed the money. Monck was a Lord Proprietor of the Bahamas, which technically oversaw these waters, but that relationship was distant. The true reason for his beachfront immortality was treasure. Before sailing off to his failure in Jamaica, Monck acted as the lead investor for an expedition by the treasure hunter Sir William Phips. Pitching the venture to a group of gentlemen of London, Monck secured the funding for Phips to search for a sunken Spanish galleon. In 1687, Phips hit the jackpot, locating the wreck of the Nuestra Senora de la Concepcion on the nearby Silver Bank. He returned to England with over 30 tons of silver. Monck's share of the recovery made him one of the wealthiest men in England overnight. It was a staggering return on investment, the 17th century equivalent of buying Bitcoin in 2010. The developers of Ambergris Cay, in their search for colonial-era branding, had sifted through the history of explorers and governors and chosen the man who got rich on a single lucky bet. It was a marketing strategy of pure genius. Rather than celebrating tedious governance or the physical peril of exploration, the island celebrates the investor. This revelation connected the dots between the map and the experience. The island wasn't a monument to history, but a monument to a successful transaction. The beach name did not honor a founder, it honored a financier. It perfectly encapsulated the spirit of modern Ambergris Cay, a place where historic isolation and natural beauty have been expertly packaged into a Veblen good, its value defined by its very expense. I stood there, looking out at the impossibly blue water, and considered the stories this place tells. There is the ancient story of geology, the tragic story of the Lucayans, and the swashbuckling fiction of pirates. And then there is the story of Christopher Monck, a cautionary tale about colonial ambition redeemed by a spectacular, improbable lottery win. I decided then that I would be back, not for the history, but for the product. Phips Gold, Silver Bank's whale sanctuary riches. A man like Christopher Monck, whose name graces the beach where I stood debating the merits of a third virgin rum punch, does not become one of England's wealthiest aristocrats by accident. He does not fund just any high-risk venture. To separate a duke from his capital requires a story so audacious and a sales pitch so compelling that it borders on delusion. Monck needed a man like Sir William Phips. Before he secured the title, William Phips was just a guy from Maine, born in 1651 into a family so poor their main export was more Phipps's. With no formal education and a career that began as a shepherd, his prospects were bleak. A life spent watching sheep is rarely a springboard to international fame. Recognizing this, Phips traded his flock for a hammer and apprenticed as a ship's carpenter. He was good at it. He moved to Boston, married a rich widow, a classic 17th century startup strategy, and established himself as a merchant sea captain. But a comfortable life of legitimate trade was, for Phips, a slow death. He was bitten by a bug far worse than any shipboard pest, the legend of sunken Spanish gold. He became fixated on a single, spectacular prize, the Nuestra Senora de la Concepcion. A hurricane had smashed the galleon onto a reef system in 1641, taking with it the second-largest haul of the Spanish treasure fleet. Phips viewed this not as a salvage operation, but as a hostile takeover of a submerged bank vault. His first privately funded attempt was a disaster. He found nothing, his crew went unpaid, and they eventually staged a mutiny. Phips, a man of simple solutions, had to physically fight his employees to regain control of his ship, the 17th century equivalent of a management offsite gone violent. Broke and with a reputation stained by failure, Phips did what any logical entrepreneur would do. He doubled down. He sailed to London to seek venture capital. There, armed with little more than raw nerve, he pitched his dream to a group of investors led by Monck. This syndicate, the Gentlemen of London, was composed of aristocrats who treated finance like sport. I think of them as the syndicate scratchers, men for whom funding a treasure hunt was simply a more exciting way to burn money than cards or horses. Phips, a master salesman, convinced them to stake him, and Monck secured the royal patent that laid legal claim to the plunder. In 1687, the gamble paid out. On the treacherous reefs of the Silver Bank, Phips's men located the Concepcion. Using primitive diving bells, essentially heavy, inverted buckets trapping a pocket of air, native divers hauled up over 30 tons of silver coins, gold and jewels. It remains one of the greatest marine salvage operations in history. The English Crown took its 10% fee, and the rest was split between Phips and the syndicate. The investors saw a return so enormous it was almost comical, while the king, delighted by his cut, knighted the former shepherd. Sir William Phips was born, his new status launching him toward a political career as the Royal Governor of Massachusetts. The story of the loot did not end with Phips. In the 1970s, modern treasure hunter Bert Weber returned to the wreck with magnetometers and vacuumed up thousands of coins the barrel divers had missed. Yet experts believe even more of the Concepcion's treasure lies buried under the coral, joined by the remains of countless other ships that fell victim to the same sharp limestone. The place is an underwater museum of maritime misfortune, but today you cannot touch any of it. The Silver Bank is now a protected marine sanctuary. The Dominican Republic, in a move of profound wisdom, has banned all commercial salvage operations. The reason is simple and 60 feet long. The area is one of the world's most important breeding and calving grounds for the North Atlantic humpback whale. The modern priority has shifted from plundering a historical graveyard to protecting a living marvel. The ghosts of Spanish sailors and ambitious shipwrights must now share their watery resting place with thousands of singing cetaceans. Standing on the shore, looking out toward the horizon where those reefs hide, the calculation seemed obvious. The greatest treasure in these waters is no longer the silver. It is the life that swims above it. And unlike Phips's haul, this one is not for sale. Phips's paradox. Governor ended Salem Witch Trials. The silver Phips hauled from these reefs bought him a knighthood and a governorship, but it could not buy him judgment. In May 1692, Sir William arrived in Boston to assume his post as the first royal governor of Massachusetts. He stepped off the boat expecting the deference due a conqueror of the Spanish Main. Instead, he walked directly into a colony consuming itself with paranoia. The jails were overflowing, and the social order was disintegrating under the weight of the Salem witch panic. Phips, a man whose expertise lay in reading charts and suppressing mutinies with his fists, was suddenly tasked with performing a delicate social exorcism. His response was decisive, bullheaded, and catastrophically wrong. To manage the backlog of the accused, he established a special court, the Court of Oye and Termina. Here, the tragedy shifted from a local hysteria to a state-sanctioned purge. The court's most dangerous innovation was its acceptance of spectral evidence. This allowed accusers to claim they were being tormented by a defendant's spirit or shape, even if the defendant's physical body was elsewhere. Since these specters were invisible to everyone but the victim, the claims were impossible to disprove. It was a perfect, hermetic loop of logic. The only relevant testimony existed entirely within the accuser's mind. By validating this, the man who had mastered the mechanics of the treasure hunt unleashed the machinery of judicial murder, sending 20 innocent people to their deaths. It is likely Phips viewed the court as he viewed a salvage operation, a practical mechanism to clear an obstruction. But the accusations climbed the social ladder with terrifying speed. By autumn, the hysteria reached a name that finally gave the governor pause. According to historical accounts, the afflicted hurried past the outcasts and began whispering the name of Lady Phips. With the abstract legal debate suddenly threatening his own household, and under pressure from influential ministers like Increase Mather, Phips slammed on the brakes. In October, he dissolved the court he had created and forbade the use of spectral evidence. Forced to rely on provable facts, the remaining cases collapsed and the fever broke. Phips's legacy remains a study in contradiction. He is the authority who enabled the tragedy and the executive who found the courage to end it. He was uniquely suited to finding sunken gold, yet profoundly unsuited to identifying a moral catastrophe until it sat at his own dinner table. His troubles did not end with the trials. His rough governance made him powerful enemies, and in 1694 he was recalled to London to answer charges of misconduct. The final showdown never came. Before he could clear his name or suffer condemnation, Sir William was ambushed by a microscopic adversary. The official record cites a malignant fever, a quiet, internal siege that bypassed the defences of a man who had survived hurricanes and pirates. He died on February 18, 1695, at the age of 44, buried in a London church, a world away from the main frontier of his birth. The hero of the Silver Bank was felled not by a storm or a sword, but by a biological glitch. Ghosts in the machine. Phips may have died of a fever, but the most dangerous contagion he encountered in Massachusetts survived him. While he eventually halted the trials, the legal standard he initially validated, spectral evidence, slipped its chains and managed to outlive the colony itself. It is a concept that appeals to a timeless human weakness, the eagerness to accept as fact anything that feels emotionally satisfying, regardless of proof. Sit long enough with a glowing screen on a remote island, and you realize that the spectres of today do not rattle chains in a shadowy forest. They arrive via fiber optic cables, flickering to life in the pale blue light of the feed. The modern incarnation of Phips's ghost is the online tribunal. Here, an accusation is often stripped of context and launched into the ether, where a global jury convenes to presume guilt before the target has even unlocked their phone. The sentence is immediate: public shaming and professional immolation. The accusation itself becomes the spectre, a malevolent cloud that hangs over a reputation forever, archived on servers and impossible to disprove to an audience that has already scrolled to the next outrage. Sir William had the decency to convene a formal court for his fiasco. We now conduct ours in the idle moments between emails. This dynamic relies on a subtler, more insidious form of spectral evidence, the assertion of hidden motives as fact. A vague statement is interpreted in the worst possible light, and that interpretation, the presumption of a hateful heart or a bigoted mind, is presented as the verdict. The crime is not the action, but the alleged thought. It is a claim about the invisible internal state of another human being, a charge against which there is no defense. It is akin to prosecuting a man for blasphemy based on the shape of a cloud passing over his house. The evidence is whatever the accuser imagines it to be. We need not look back to the 17th century to see this mechanism at work. During the moral panics of the 1980s, the repressed memory became the new spectral evidence. Accusations of ritual abuse were excavated years after the alleged fact, based entirely on subjective recollection. In courtrooms across America, the internal memory of the accuser was treated as concrete proof, leaving defendants to construct alibis for Tuesday afternoons that had occurred decades prior. It is peculiar how proud we are of our enlightened modernity, even as we fall for the same old tricks. The pattern remains identical to the one that doomed the people of Salem. An emotionally supercharged claim displaces objective inquiry. The burden of proof is inverted, and the roar of the consensus drowns out the search for truth. We have simply traded a Puritan village for a global network, but the ghost of 1692 remains a very powerful user. As we close this chapter on salt, spectral evidence, and sunken treasure, we're reminded that history's most consequential decisions often emerge from the intersection of opportunity and desperation. William Phips's journey from treasure hunter to witch trial administrator reveals how quickly fortune can transform ordinary individuals into agents of both prosperity and peril. Perhaps the most sobering lesson lies in recognizing how readily we still embrace our own versions of spectral evidence when the stakes feel high enough. But what happens when those who bet everything on loyalty find themselves exiled to unfamiliar shores? Next time, we'll explore how American Loyalists attempted to rebuild their plantation dreams in the Caicos Islands, only to discover that paradise and profit rarely align as expected. If you enjoyed this journey, the complete travelogue is available right now as a Kindle book on Amazon, Monck, and Consequence. And if you want to come behind the scenes and get bonus content, you can join my community on Patreon. On this episode of The Rise the Limit, we explore Chapter 11, on Turks and Caicos, Empire's Cotton Unravels. After the American Revolution, defeated Loyalists faced a bitter irony. Those who had bet everything on the winning side of empire suddenly found themselves on the losing end of history, forced to rebuild their plantation dreams on unfamiliar Caribbean soil. Tonight, we follow these displaced planters as they attempted to recreate their cotton kingdoms in the Turks and Caicos Islands, only to discover that loyalty to the crown was no match for the harsh realities of island agriculture. On Turks and Caicos, Empire's Cotton Unravels. Stone structures, settlers' struggle, survival. Turning from the carbon fiber debris of the modern space age, my son and I faced a much older variety of wreckage. The shift induced a specific kind of historical whiplash. We stood before a low, crumbling wall, a relic of men who sought permanence but achieved only a short, sweaty footnote in the history of Caribbean failure. It called to mind Edward Gibbon's assessment of Rome. Monuments often outlast their creators, yet remain perishable and frail. These are the ruins of a Loyalist settlement built by refugees who bet on the losing side of the American Revolution and fled to the empire's limestone fringes. The resort's welcome packet, possessing the unearned confidence of a party guest explaining the stock market, labeled them the Colonel Browne Ruins, circa 1768. This is a spectacular bit of fiction. The date is too early, and the man was elsewhere. The real Colonel Thomas Browne did run plantations in the Turks and Caicos, but his holdings were located miles away on North and Middle Caicos. Attaching his name to these humble stones on Ambergris Cay is like claiming a random minivan abandoned in a field was Napoleon's personal battle chariot. It adds prestige, but it is pure marketing fluff. A nearby sign complicated the narrative further, attributing the settlement to an Abraham H.S. Smith. Sensing a lead, I searched the digital archives for Smith, hoping to unearth a forgotten pioneer. The investigation hit a dead end. Abraham H.S. Smith appears to be a phantom, likely conjured by a committee that needed a name for a brochure. This aligns perfectly with other signage across the archipelago, which presents the fringe theory of Columbus's local landfall as gospel truth. The real story here is not about a single famous man, but a collective, spectacular collapse. The Loyalists who landed on these cays tried to build a life out of limestone and bravado. They raised cattle and erected these walls using mortar made from burned, crushed conch shells, cementing their ambitions with the remains of their dinner. Their goal was to master the land. Instead, the land broke them. The venture was a perfect storm of catastrophe. The soil was thin, the rain was a myth, and the boll weevil treated their cotton fields like an endless buffet. Add the occasional hurricane to wash away their progress, and you have a business plan seemingly authored by a vengeful god. Within a single generation, they were gone. They packed their silver, fled the scrubland, and often left their enslaved workers behind in a final act of callous desperation. What remains are these skeletal outlines of houses and stables, baked by 2 centuries of unrelenting sun. They do not honor Colonel Browne or the spectral Abraham Smith, but rather the crushing reality of an environment that refused to be tamed by people who had run out of better options. Staring at the bleached stones, I weighed my next move. Retreat to the resort, where history is a neatly packaged anecdote, or linger a while longer with the ghosts. Loyalist lives, losing land, legalities, liberty. Lingering among the wreckage offered a necessary correction to the standard American curriculum. Until this expedition, my understanding of the Revolution resembled a school play: powdered wigs, a few rousing speeches, and a bell ringing in Philadelphia. It is presented as a glorious national birth, a sterilizing event that laid the groundwork for a perfect union. The truth, visible in the limestone rubble of Ambergris Cay, was messier. The Revolution was America's first civil war. For every winner in a tri-cornered hat, there was a loser packing bags. These were the Loyalists, and their story ended not with a statue, but with exile to the empire's fringes. We are taught to picture these dissenters as a gaggle of foppish aristocrats clutching sherry decanters. But that is a cartoon drawn by the victors. The reality was that up to 1 in 5 white colonists stood with the Crown. They were recent Scottish immigrants, blacksmiths, and merchant farmers who preferred the stability of British trade laws. Some were genuine conservatives who feared rebellion would unleash anarchy, believing it safer to fix the system from within. It is the eternal debate: renovate the house or burn it down for the insurance money. The patriots chose the fire. Their motives were as varied as their backgrounds. In New York, tenant farmers sided with the king to spite their patriot landlords, turning the global conflict into a glorified rent strike. Pacifist groups like the Quakers saw the Crown as the lesser of two violent evils. In a sharp irony, thousands of enslaved African Americans identified their best chance for freedom not with Washington, but with the British. When Virginia's governor, Lord Dunmore, promised liberty to any enslaved man who abandoned a patriot master to fight for the king, he offered a deal far more tangible than abstract pronouncements about the rights of man. Choosing the losing side of a revolution creates immediate physical consequences. Neighbors formed committees and the atmosphere turned perilous. Patriot groups like the Sons of Liberty acted as enforcers of a chemically aggressive civic spirit. Their signature tactic was tarring and feathering, a political statement that combined third-degree burns with the aesthetic of a nightmarish arts and crafts project. Thomas Browne, the same man whose name is erroneously plastered on the ruins before me, was a victim of this zeal. In Georgia, a mob fractured his skull and burned off the soles of his feet. The experience radicalized him, a mild way of saying he dedicated the remainder of the war to seeking Baroque revenge before eventually fleeing to these islands. If the mobs failed to break you, the provisional government finished the job. The patriots championed liberty while passing laws to make life for dissenters a bureaucratic hell. Test laws forced men to swear allegiance to the new states. Refusal meant illegally holding property or losing the right to sue when a neighbor's pig ate your pumpkins. Confiscation acts allowed states to seize and sell Loyalist assets, a convenient method of funding the war effort. Dissenters were driven from their homes and banished under threat of execution. It was a nationwide cancellation, enforced with muskets. You might argue that they bet on the wrong empire and received their due. Perhaps. But standing on a scrubby island settled by these refugees, looking at stone walls raised in a final, desperate attempt at solvency, the human cost of that political line becomes tangible. For every founding father who secured a monument, there was a founding uncle who got the boot, forced into the wilderness to build a life from scratch because he zigged when George Washington zagged. The Loyalist Diaspora, Exile, and New Beginnings. The ghosts lingering among the limestone were the debris of a geopolitical collision. For the losers of the American Revolution, the end of combat marked the beginning of homelessness. The 1783 Treaty of Paris, signed alongside the Treaty of Versailles, creating legitimate confusion for centuries of history students, officially halted hostilities and contained a polite suggestion that the victorious Americans might consider returning seized property to the Loyalists. The new states received this advice with the consideration usually reserved for a junk mail flyer. Persecution had been a favorite pastime during the war, and with the conflict resolved, it calcified into official policy. Faced with legal retribution and the lingering hostility of neighbors who had recently tried to tar them, tens of thousands decided the United States was no longer a viable address. This realization triggered a frantic scramble for a place to land. Between 60 and 80,000 refugees scattered across the map of the remaining British Empire. The majority headed north, flooding into the territories that would become Ontario and New Brunswick. This influx of resentful Anglophones helped forge a Canadian identity grounded in a firm refusal to be American. A wealthier minority, numbering around 7,500, sailed for Great Britain. There they encountered a social disaster, viewed by the London elite as provincial failures who had botched the simple task of holding a continent. A different group, primarily planters from the southern colonies, looked to the Caribbean. They sought to reboot a slave-based economy facilitated by British policies that encouraged the transport of enslaved households. Their first stop was often British East Florida, a decision that displayed a tragic knack for bad timing. The same treaty arrangements that ended the war handed Florida back to Spain, forcing the refugees into a second, panicked migration. Many gathered their families and the roughly 1,200 enslaved people they held in bondage, and sailed for the arid safety of the Turks and Caicos Islands. Here, they launched a grand agricultural experiment, an attempt to conjure a plantation economy from the thin, salty soil. They planted Sea Island cotton, and for a season or two, the crop flourished. Then the local ecosystem responded with a series of plagues: nutrient depletion, hurricanes, and the boll weevil, an insect that treated the cotton fields as an all-you-can-eat buffet. The endeavor was a spectacular failure. By the 1820s, the venture had collapsed. Most of the aspiring cotton barons cut their losses and fled, abandoning their crumbling estates. Crucially, they also abandoned the people they had enslaved. These men and women, left behind on the islands, formed the resilient foundation of the modern Caicos population. Their permanence stands in sharp contrast to the trajectory of the black Loyalists who had been evacuated to Nova Scotia. Frustrated by broken promises and a harsh northern climate, that group organized a final migration in 1792, sailing across the Atlantic to found Freetown in Sierra Leone, an attempt at self-determination on a new continent. On Ambergris Cay, however, the story ended in silence. The low stone walls and foundations that remain are monuments to a desperate gamble. The settlers here lived a tragic inversion of the Aeneas myth. They fled their own burning Troy, but instead of founding a new Rome, they washed up on these shores to watch their ambitions grind to dust against the limestone. They left behind only ruins and the enduring communities built by the people they abandoned. Crown's combat, Colonel's campaign. The signage at the ruins invites visitors to imagine Colonel Browne walking these grounds, yet the specific history of the man suggests he likely walked with a limp. To understand why he, or at least his name, ended up on the limestone margins of the Caribbean, one must look north to the humid, politically charged frontier of colonial Georgia. It was there, in 1774, that Thomas Browne arrived from Yorkshire with what amounted to a gentleman planter's starter kit: £3,000 of family money, a retinue of 70 indentured servants, and a grant for over 5,000 acres of prime real estate upriver from Augusta. He named his new estate Brownsborough, a choice suggesting that modesty was not among the virtues he had packed for the crossing. To cap his ascent, the royal governor appointed him a magistrate, a decision that proved to have the tactical wisdom of appointing a fox to guard a henhouse. Browne's ambition, however grand, failed to account for a disruptive market force, a revolution. As fervour swept the colonies, Browne remained stubbornly loyal to Great Britain. When the local revolutionary committee demanded he join a trade boycott, he politely declined. On August 2, 1775, this principled stand was met with a visitation from roughly 130 Liberty Boys. They arrived at his doorstep demanding he swear an oath to their cause. Browne, maintaining the composure of a formal Englishman, refused again, stating he could never enter into an engagement to take up arms against the country which gave him being. The mob, having little appreciation for rhetorical nuances, responded with a level of violence that was both gruesome and oddly specific. They fractured his skull and scalped him, though only partially, before applying the traditional coat of tar and feathers. Then came a horrifyingly bespoke touch. They held him down and roasted the soles of his feet over a fire. This act of homespun torture cost him several toes and earned him the moniker Burnfoot Browne. He survived, but with severe headaches that would later require surgeons to remove bone fragments from his skull. The violence achieved a conversion, though not the one the mob intended. Browne's political opinions were now calcified by trauma. From that day forward, he was a walking argument for the Crown, fueled by a burning need for retribution. Fleeing to British-held territory, he traded his planter's ledger for a commission presenting a detailed strategy to retake the southern colonies. By 1776, he was a lieutenant colonel in the Florida Rangers, later the King's Rangers, and proved brutally effective. He spent years embedding himself with the Creek and Cherokee nations, building a formidable network of indigenous allies who shared his grievances against American encroachment. As the British superintendent to these nations, he became a master of frontier warfare, leading his rangers in major engagements at Savannah and Augusta. Yet even his tactical successes could not stem the wider tide of defeat. When he eventually surrendered Fort Cornwallis in 1781, his reputation as a partisan leader was so severe that the victors despised him. He required an armed escort just to survive his departure from the city, a man so thoroughly unmoored from the new American reality that exile was no longer a choice, but a necessity for survival. Island Odyssey, Browne's bold bordering. If Thomas Browne possessed a personal motto, it was likely that quitting is for fools. Perhaps the most obstinate man of the 18th century, the lieutenant colonel was not one to let the loss of a continent-spanning war dampen his ambition. Having been run out of Georgia with an armed escort to prevent his former neighbors from finishing the dismemberment they had started, Browne found himself a man without a country but with a powerful thirst for vindication. My own small quest to sort out the historical error on the resort's plaque required me to first follow the ghost of this man, a figure whose post-war career was a masterclass in refusing to read the room. After the Americans rudely won their independence, the British Crown faced a personnel crisis. The empire was saddled with thousands of Loyalists who had bet on the losing side, and, to complicate matters, the Treaty of Paris in 1783 handed their refuge in British East Florida back to Spain. Browne, already physically scarred by his allegiance, was evicted again, a tenant in a cosmic geopolitical foreclosure. The British government, motivated by equal parts gratitude and a desire to move these angry men to the periphery, initiated a resettlement program. Surveys identified the best soil as lying within the Caicos Islands. Between 1789 and 1790, citing exceptional services, a polite bureaucratic euphemism for his talent at making American lives miserable, the Crown granted Browne a massive tract on North and Middle Caicos. To work this new fiefdom, he transported over 600 enslaved people, a grim migration intended to build a new dream on old misery. He promptly adopted the life of a planter baron, marrying the teenage daughter of a peer and naming the local town Whitby, presumably because the blistering Caribbean sun reminded him of the gentle mists of Yorkshire. His ambition was breathtaking. He claimed to cultivate thousands of acres of cotton, grapes, and corn, boasting of profits that would make a king blush. His management style, however, remained distinctly martial. Rather than cramming people into barracks, he allocated each enslaved family an acre of land, spreading them across the property to encourage self-sufficiency. He also refused to sell individuals and purchased people from other plantations to facilitate marriages. This was not soft-hearted enlightenment. It was the cold calculation of a military commander securing the loyalty of his garrison. When war with France flared, Browne reverted to warlord mode. He wrote to London claiming he had constructed 2 forts at his own expense and had armed, clothed, and disciplined all of his Negro men for defense. He swelled with pride over their fidelity, and a 1798 report describes his all-black crew driving off a French privateer with muskets and a cannon. Historical records suggest his fort building was largely a home renovation project on existing structures, another line item on a padded bill sent to the Crown for reimbursement, but the defence was real. Yet for all his fortifications, Browne could not defeat the islands themselves. The soil was thin, the hurricanes were unforgiving, and the crops failed entirely. The grand agricultural experiment collapsed into bankruptcy. But a man like Burnfoot Browne did not admit defeat. He simply changed battlefields. In 1802, he petitioned for another grant and received 6,000 acres on St. Vincent. He faced the logistical nightmare of moving his operation across the sea once more, adding an E to his surname to become Browne, as if a vowel could wash away the past. He died a wealthy sugar planter in 1825, leaving the Caicos behind as a mere footnote in his ledger, which left the question hanging in the hot, salt air over Ambergris Cay. If Browne packed up and left, who built the ruins standing in front of me? Salt Sage. Shifting Shores. I stood expecting the dramatic footprints of an exiled warrior. The archives, however, offered a correction. The dashing soldier was a phantom of local law. The man who actually laid claim to this scrub-covered kingdom was a Bermudian merchant named Captain John Lightbourne Sr. I had come seeking the romance of a lost Loyalist rebellion, and instead I found the meticulous ledger entries of a salt proprietor. Legends may favor the sword, but history often favors the receipt. Records indicate that Lightbourne of Bermuda's Warwick tribe became the first private owner of Ambergris Cay in 1811. He did not seize the land in a fit of revolutionary fervor. He purchased it from the Bahamas administration, likely utilizing the briny profits of the salt trade. This transaction transformed the Cay from a loosely occupied territory, historians speak for nobody asked the people already fishing there, into a defined commercial asset. Lightbourne was a man of diverse interests, maintaining trade routes between Bermuda, New York, and London. His correspondence reveals a life defined not by swashbuckling adventure but by the sort of financial headaches that would make a modern hedge fund manager weep. He juggled oscillating currencies, the collapse of London banks like Brickwood's Daniell and Company, and the American embargo of 1807, which acted as a geopolitical shutter on his primary markets. To manage this sprawling web of maritime logistics, Lightbourne relied on the time-honored tradition of nepotism. His letters paint a vivid picture of a man constantly dashing off instructions to his nephew William Astwood. Astwood served as his attorney, agent, and general fixer in Bermuda, handling everything from property sales to the domestic needs of Aunt Lightbourne. Even in the 19th century, the secret to being a verifiable titan of industry was apparently having a capable nephew one could annoy with errands. Yet the portfolio of John Lightbourne Sr. contained holdings far darker than piles of salt or acres of scrubland. He was a slave owner. His will, drafted with the same bureaucratic precision applied to his cargo manifests, listed enslaved individuals by name, bequeathing human beings alongside furniture and livestock. It is a stark anchor that drags the narrative from the airy heights of the maritime merchant down to the brutal reality of the era. While his interests spanned the archipelago, the system he upheld faced constant resistance. In 1823, a group of enslaved people from his barracks on Grand Turk successfully escaped, sailing to Haiti and claiming their freedom. Lightbourne's own end was considerately less heroic. He did not perish in a duel or a hurricane. On September 16, 1819, the master of trade, the owner of islands, and the captain of ships succumbed to quinsy. It is a grim historical irony that a man who made his fortune on the high seas was ultimately defeated by a severe case of tonsillitis. I walked to the edge of the island, where the map designated a sharp jut of land as Lightbourne Point. I looked out over the turquoise water, scanning the horizon for the ghosts of salt barks or the spectral sails of escapees, feeling the rough limestone beneath my sandals. But the ocean offered no ghosts, and the wind carried no whispers of ledgers or nephews. There was only the name on the map, a silent, static claim that outlasted the man who bought it. Amber's Ascent, Aunt's Atlantic Acquisition. Following the financial breadcrumbs John Lightbourne Sr. left behind felt like a proper historical quest, a continuation of the inquiry into the soul of this limestone splinter. Having identified the salt merchant who purchased the land, the question remained, why naming rights? Did Lightbourne buy this cay because he had actually found the substance here, or was the title a hopeful piece of branding, a tribute to a lottery ticket coughed up by a sperm whale? The answer lay not in a buried chest, but in a piece of correspondence from 1809. In this letter, Lightbourne instructed his nephew, the perpetually busy William Astwood, to manage a delivery from a Mr. Samuel Watson. The package contained 7 ounces of ambergris, specified as being of the first quality. Lightbourne directed Astwood to ship this waxy prize to London as an adventure for his Aunt Lightbourne. In the commercial language of the 19th century, an adventure did not imply pirates or storms. It was a term for a speculative private shipment, a maritime side hustle. The outcome of this venture strips the romance from the map entirely. Astwood later reported that the 7 ounces sold in London for the extremely well price of 16 shillings per ounce. The grand total came to a respectable £7 and 12 shillings. And what did Aunt Lightbourne do with this windfall from the world's most prized perfume fixative, a substance hunted by kings? She bought socks. The letter confirms the funds were used to purchase a stock of ladies' weight cotton hose. The mystery of the deep was liquidated to keep an aunt's ankles warm. This transaction demanded a conversion to modern currency. Adjusting for 2 centuries of inflation, that £5.60 would be roughly $900 today, a decent bonus, but hardly enough to justify the name of an island. This is where history and the modern market part ways. Today, finding a 7-ounce lump of aged grey ambergris is akin to stumbling upon a brick of gold. Depending on the buyer, that same chunk could fetch anywhere from $4,000 to nearly $24,000. Suddenly, the island's name appears rational. Lightbourne did not name the cay for a single pair of socks, but for the tantalizing mathematics of what a larger find might yield. For a visiting American with dreams of striking it rich on a morning stroll, however, this valuation comes with a distinct legal hazard. Before scanning the tide line for floating retirement funds, one must consult the United States Code. Under the Marine Mammal Protection Act, the collection, possession or sale of ambergris is illegal. It is a product of the sperm whale, a protected species. Finding it does not make you a millionaire, it makes you an accidental wildlife trafficker. Possessing this odorous treasure is a federal crime on par with selling a bald eagle feather. I resumed my walk along the surf with newfound wariness, viewing every pale, waxy lump in the sand not as a potential fortune, but as a felony waiting to happen. Cotton's cold claim, Caicos's colonial cruelty. The mystery of the ambergris connected the island to the whims of global trade, but the crumbling walls nearby spoke of a more stubborn, terrestrial delusion. While men like Lightbourne looked to the waves for fortune, others looked to the rock itself. Fortune hunting in the 18th century Caribbean was rarely limited to oceanic flotsam. For the most ambitious refugees, the dream was not a lucky find, but an empire built on land and labor. The archetype of this terrestrial hunger was Wade Stubbs. Unlike the Bermudian merchant class playing the trade winds, Stubbs was a Loyalist refugee from Cheshire, England, who had seen his cotton plantations in Georgia and Florida seized by victorious revolutionaries. For most, losing a war and two fortunes might suggest it is time to take up a quiet hobby. Stubbs, however, viewed the loss as a cosmic clerical error that could only be rectified if the British Crown provided him a new country to farm. In a manner of speaking, it did. He arrived in the Caicos Islands and, as a consolation prize for his displacement, was granted 860 acres in 1789, with another 100 thrown in shortly after. On this slice of limestone, he established the Wade's Green Plantation. The endeavor was a veritable Manhattan project of agricultural wishful thinking. While the surrounding islands were busy boiling the ocean down into mountains of salt, the region's reliable currency, Stubbs was a cotton man. He surveyed the sun-blasted rock and thorny scrub and declared it prime farmland, a conviction he held with the magnificent obstinacy required to build either a dynasty or an asylum. He eventually acquired Cheshire Hall and Hallover plantations, ultimately controlling over 8,000 acres. He constructed a legacy on a business plan about as sound as opening a ski resort in Miami. Yet one does not coax a fortune from coral rock through optimism alone. Stubbs's enterprise, like that of his contemporaries, ran on a dark and monstrous engine. The official slave register, compiled the year of his death in 1822, provides the grim accounting. It was not the land that made Wade Stubbs the most successful planter in the island's history. It was the people. His 8,000-acre domain was propped up by the forced labor of 384 human beings. He was a justice of the peace, a pillar of the community, and the territory's single largest owner of men, women, and children. The family name became a persistent legacy adopted by those he had enslaved, which explains why Stubbs remains a common surname on the islands today. His story ends not with a whimper, but with the stark, quiet mathematics of a colonial ledger, Wade Stubbs, proprietor. And that brings us to the close of Chapter 11, on Turks and Caicos, Empire's Cotton Unravels. The Loyalist dream of recreating plantation prosperity in these remote islands crumbled within a generation, defeated by harsh realities of soil and storm, leaving behind only stone ruins and the communities built by those they had enslaved. Next time in Chapter 12, we'll follow the rise of Horatio Stubbs, a Yale-educated planter's son who witnessed his family's pivot from failed cotton to the salt trade, and trace Ambergris Cay's long journey from industrial extraction to modern conservation. If you enjoyed this journey, the complete travelogue is available right now as a Kindle book on Amazon, Conch, and Consequence. And if you want to come behind the scenes and get bonus content, you can join my community on Patreon.